Okay, we're currently loading the Chapter 15 Islamic Civilization Takeaway. And you see here on the opening screen, you have a map of Islamic expansion, starting with the dark orange, which is when Muhammad was still around. You can see it's on the Arabian Peninsula on the western part and a little piece on the eastern part. Then you have the slightly lighter orange, which shows you how far Islam expanded under the four rightly guided caliphs. And then finally, you have the pink area, which is where it expanded to under the Umayyad dynasty, which is where it reached the Arab Islamic dynasty, reached its highest point. So that's why that graphic is there, sort of show you the quick, rapid expansion from 622 to 750. Arabic Islamic Empire grew very quickly. One of the things that comes out of this, of course, is the growth of enduring cities. The Muslim world was centered very much around trade at the time, and so that lends itself to cities. You go where the market is. Each of these cities has a significance to Islam. Mecca, obviously, is the religious center of Islam. 5 times a day, Muslims turn their attention toward the Kaaba in the center of Mecca, and also go on their Hajj once in a lifetime if they are capable of doing so. The second city is Medina, where the first mosque was set up by Muhammad and his followers as they escaped from Mecca to Medina during the Hijrah. And it's also where the tomb of the Prophet is, and the first capital under the four rightly guided caliphs. Damascus was significant because that was the Umayyad capital. It is close to the Mediterranean Sea and at the end of sort of the Silk Road. So, and it's right at that place where Africa, Asia, and Europe closely meet. So it was a great location for a capital for a rapidly growing trade-based empire. After the decline of the Umayyads, the city of Baghdad became the capital under the Abbasid dynasty. Baghdad has great access to trade routes as well, particularly since it is in Mesopotamia and has the nearby Tigris and Euphrates River, which give it access to the Persian Gulf and ultimately out into the Indian Ocean, where they could trade with East Africa, Southeast Asia, and India. Cairo was an important city in early Islamic Empire because on the Nile there, which is where a lot of their material came from, the cotton that they grew for the textiles that they sold. Cairo was an important city because if you were coming from West Africa to go on your Hajj, say like Ibn Battuta, who we studied, or if you were going to go west to, say, Spain, across from Asia, you would probably pass through Cairo. And if you remember our reading on Ibn Battuta, he was quite impressed with the bustling nature of this large city. And finally, we come to Cordoba, which was the most important city in Muslim Spain. So again, here you have cities on 3 different continents, mostly in Asia, but some in Africa and some in Europe even. So these are why some of the cities are important. And again, remember, in a trade-based society, cities are very important. Textiles. Textiles were what the Muslims brought to the table when they were trading with China for porcelain or for silk or for paper or for gunpowder, or if they were trading with Africa for salt and gold, or Europe for amber and furs. Egyptian cotton from the Nile Valley was an important fabric. Egyptian cotton is soft, it's durable, you can wash it more easily than you could, say, silk or linen or things like that. And so it was a very useful thing. It absorbed moisture and so kept you cool. All those things made it a very useful textile. Persian carpets also came out of the Islamic Empire. Persian carpets, again, were a very useful tool. Obviously, they're very decorative in the way they're designed, but it isn't just the decorative nature. If you are a nomad or if you are a trader traveling on the Silk Road, these served many purposes. The carpets were a nice soft place to lay your head at night, a comfortable place to sit on the cold, hard, dry ground. As you were leaving and moving, you could even use it as luggage, roll it up and put your belongings in there to keep them safe and keep them from perhaps some damage along the road. So again, very useful trade goods for the Muslim Empire. In the field of mathematics, of course, Muslims invented algebra. One particular scholar who was noted for his contribution to mathematics was Al-Khwarizmi. You can see here an artist rendering of him on a stamp. He made various advances in the field of algebra, making it much more useful, and increasing the ways in which it could be used to solve very difficult problems that we still use today in mathematics. He was also one of the ones who introduced Arabic numerals to Europe to replace Roman numerals, which are more difficult to add up in terms of if you're doing inventory or if you're doing trade in terms of money. Arabic numerals are much easier to use than, say, your typical Roman numerals, which are more difficult to sort of add up and quickly. They don't have the concept, for instance, of zero represented by a symbol. So again, many advances in mathematics were brought about by the Arab Islamic Empire. In medicine, we have the field of medicine. There were many innovations that the Muslim world came up with. They improved hospitals in many ways. For instance, putting pharmacies in the hospitals, which is a great advance because you don't have to go out and, once you diagnose somebody, run out and find the medicinal plant that you need and hope that it's in season. You keep some in stock. They also were capable of doing some operations that to us seem pretty amazing, considering they were doing minor brain surgery, like relieving pressure from fluid building up on the brain, or removing cancerous tumors that were visible on the outside of the body, or removing cataracts. In addition to that, they also came up with the idea, which doesn't seem so revolutionary to us because we're so used to doing it, but putting people in different parts of the hospital that have different symptoms, rather than putting two people with different symptoms in the same room and having them catch each other's disease. This was a good idea to sort of separate people with differing sets of symptoms. Ultimately, one of the best ideas was that of Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna in Europe, who came up with the idea of a medical encyclopedia. Rather than depending on your doctor to have, come across this particular set of symptoms before, your doctor could then look up and benefit from the medical knowledge of many doctors and many people in curing your ills. Otherwise, it was pretty much a trial and error type of situation. The book was actually so useful that it was later translated into Latin, which is when he became known as Avicenna, and was used by European doctors. And for many centuries, this was the go-to guide. Doctors these days, for centuries, have still used sort of various versions of medical encyclopedia. Now, of course, the transition is going more and more towards the internet. But again, the idea of putting all medical knowledge sort of in one reliable place is a very groundbreaking idea. You can see in the Islamic version here, which of course reads from right to left, pages that talk about the various body systems and how they interact and the various organs and things like that. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a book with the title Avicennae Arabum, which is talking about Avicenna the Arab and his medical encyclopedia. So all kinds of advances in medicine. Literature, the 1001 Nights, that came out of a rich tradition in the Arab, Persian, and other Muslim countries, their world, where they had a rich tradition of literature. I remember the Bedouins we talked about having an oral tradition of literature, which is how they memorized things such as the Quran and the Sunnah and tales of fables and adventures and romances that they could then use as entertainment around the firelight at night. Even after they had the ability to print things, again, for the Bedouins, you want to travel light. You don't want to carry heavy books with you. So again, storytelling was very important. The 1001 Nights is one of the best examples of this. It's a framed story of Scheherazade, who is trying to save her life from a sultan who often disposes of his wives after a very short period of time. But she managed to tell a number of fables and adventure stories that are so interesting, he finally falls in love with her and keeps her. One of the series of these tales were a series of adventures of Sinbad the Sailor, which has been made into several movies, starting in the mid 20th century, even up to the late 20th century and early 21st century, in cartoons and movies and things like that. Lumped in with this story, the 1001 Nights, when it came to Europe, was the story of a boy who found a magical lamp that had a genie in it that allowed him to woo a princess who was known as Ala-ad-Din. This was originally a Persian tale, but when translators put it together, they lumped that story in with the rest of it. And, well, many of us have seen that movie many times. History. One of the interesting things that was done in history in the Arab world, Muslim world, was, in fact, a new approach to history. Whereas the Greeks often told the story of what happened in history, An example from the Islamic world is Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun noticed that as he analyzed various dynasties in history, that they followed a certain pattern. He saw the rise to prominence, the golden era, golden age where things went well and the culture flourished, and then finally the decline as leaders were more interested in the perks of being a ruler rather than doing the actual job of ruling. And so this was one of the first times that there was an approach to history where you wanted to learn from history and analyze it for things you could learn from it rather than just tell the story of it, which is, more like how we do history today. We look at it as something, how do we avoid the mistakes of the past? In astronomy, there are a number of advances. Remember, in the Muslim world, astronomy is very important. As traders, they often need to navigate, and so astronomy was one of the best ways. As you go across Asia, there are many places that are desertified, very hot, very dry, and sometimes the best way to travel is actually at night, where it's cooler, and make your tent to stay and sleep during the day. So they became very interested in stars. They realized that even in the old days before streetlights, that the fires of various villages and towns and cities created a certain amount of light pollution. And so they created observatories outside the boundaries of these cities where the sky was darker. They were able then to make very accurate star charts. They were able to make much more accurate solar calendars, sort of figuring out exactly how long it took, or pretty close to exactly how long the Earth took to go around the sun. And one enterprising mathematician and astronomer, Abu al-Biruni, actually was able to measure the Earth using mathematics, using various trigonometric ideas, and came pretty close, got fairly accurate measurement based on the idea that the Earth was a sphere, which is not far off. It's a little bit flattened at the poles, but not a bad job based on the information they had at the time. As traders, it also, the Islamic world served as a nexus for bringing ideas from various cultures together. So, for instance, the Chinese compass, which was sort of a magnetized spoon-shaped thing, which gave us very small surface area to contact with a very highly polished plate, which cut down on the amount of friction, so that this magnet would always point to the magnetic pole. Very useful, again, for navigators and people who are traveling, especially on those nights that might be, say, overcast and it's hard to sort of navigate by the stars. Chinese papermaking process and printing press made its way across Asia as well. Obviously, the Islamic world needed it to record their Quran and Sunnah to keep it as true to the original words of the Prophet as possible. But it increased literacy wherever it went, including Europe. So these things were very important to the progress of pretty much everybody in Asia, Africa, and Europe. So you can see that the need to be literate in Arabic for practicing your religion fed a need for learning and scholarship. And this led to advances in many different fields. This is one of those things that once you have the ability to read and write, it drives a curiosity, particularly in a world where you're traveling and seeing new and wonderful things everywhere you go. So that was a very important lesson to learn, and that Islamic scholarship paves the way by preserving many of the ideas of many different cultures that lead to things like rediscovery of Aristotle and the Greeks and Roman literature during the Renaissance. So this is an important area in history.